Good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. My name is Shreya, and I am with the Ananta Center. I'm delighted to welcome you all to our session on US and India-China, the Great Power Rivalry. We are truly thrilled to have with us today Mr. Elbridge Colby, co-founder and principal of the Marathon Initiative. A very warm welcome to you, Mr. Colby, and a warm welcome to our session chair, Professor C. Raja Mohan. He has recently returned to India after serving as the director of the Institute of South Asian Studies at the National University of Singapore for 4 years. Welcome back home, Professor. Professor Mohan has been an active part of Ananta's engagements over the years, being an invaluable member of our Track 2 dialogues and forums. Many of you would know him through his successful associations with several Indian think tanks, like the Institute for Defense Studies and Analysis, and as the founding director of Carnegie India. It is a pleasure to have you with us, Professor, and thank you for chairing this session today. A request to our viewers before we begin, please send in your questions throughout the course of the discussion instead of waiting till the end. The questions can be sent in through the Q&A box at the bottom of your Zoom screens or the comment section on Facebook. And with that, over to you, Professor Mohan.
Thank you, Shreya. Good evening, everyone. Thank you all for joining us for this very special session on US, India, and China and the emergence of the great power rivalry that is in the news, that is part of our life these days. And we have a speaker here today with us, Elbridge Colby, probably the best person to speak about it at this point of time and the complex challenges that the emergence of great power rivalry poses to the United States and what does it mean for India. We're going to explore with him some of those issues. Welcome to you, Bridge. It's really a pleasure to have you with us today. Let me begin by congratulating you on your new book, The Strategy of Denial, American Defense in the Age of Great Power Conflict. It has triggered a wide-ranging debate within the US on the nature of the US military strategy, its problems, and the way in which the US can develop an effective military strategy to deal with China in particular, which is of great interest to us here in India. Bridge, if you have a copy of the book, it'll be wonderful if you can show it at some point. That'll be nice for our people, for our viewers today to see the book in its physical form. But before we talk about some of the ideas in the book, let me introduce you briefly to our viewers this evening. Elbridge Colby is the co-founder and principal of the Marathon Initiative, a policy initiative focused on developing strategies to prepare the United States for an era of sustained great power competition. That for after nearly 3 decades of relative harmony among the major powers, we are back in the middle of renewed great power rivalry, and Bridge's work is actually focused on the nature of that rivalry, what it means for the United States. Bridge has an expansive experience in the US government, and he is really on with the US think tanks, focused on defense and strategic issues. He had a stint as the director of the defense programs at the Center for New American Security. And during 2017 to 18, he served as the Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for Strategy and Force Development at the Pentagon. In that role, he led the development and rollout of the US Defense Department's National Defense Strategy in 2018, which shifted US defense focus to the challenges presented by China and Russia. So it was a very, very critical moment in the recent evolution of the United States. Bridges' work and his book comes amidst a great churn in global politics by the rise of China, its great muscular reassertion of its dominance in the region, and the reemergence of Russia as an important actor in Europe. This in turn has led to a significant rearrangement of the security order in Europe, Asia, if you want to call it Eurasia, and the Indo-Pacific maritime domain. It also comes amidst a profound transformation of the US security policies. And Bridges had an active role in shaping the transformation. And today he's outside the government, but he's an active participant in the debate on the US strategy in this more complicated environment 3 decades after the end of the Cold War and a period of general tranquility among the major powers over the last 3 decades. For us in India, as for Indian policy and the political community, it's very important to understand this debate, the US debate. Many of us now instinctively know from the headlines, the US is locked in a conflict right now with Russia in the heart of Europe, and also with China in Asia. But for us, I think while the general, beyond the general impression, I think we need to understand the complexities of US debate, how the US is thinking about these issues, because it's not just enough to merely take the headline, and that we need to see the factors shaping the US debate, because nothing affects us more than what the US does in relation to China and Russia. The challenges posed to us by China are no longer limited to the Himalayas, where we are locked in a prolonged military standoff with the People's Liberation Army. India also confronts a growing naval presence, China's naval presence in the Indian Ocean. China also undermines India's traditional primacy in the subcontinent as it cultivates deeper strategic and military ties with India's neighbors. China also, is not just a military problem. There is a recognition in Delhi today. China also poses a problem for India's economic prosperity, that India's uncritical globalization of the last 3 decades has actually saw China's role in hollowing out India's manufacturing industry, and as a consequence, India's withdrawal from the regional comprehensive partnership in Asia. On the technological side too, large parts of Indian telecom and digital industry were deeply hooked into China. And now India is trying to reverse some of that, with its decision to keep China out of the 5G rollout in India. So then in that sense, China today poses a significant problem and challenge for Indian policymakers. And it's not just a temporary problem. Dealing with China is going to take a whole generational task for India as the power gap between India and China grows. Dealing with this challenge from China is really central to India's foreign policy and foreign and security policies. And within that context, if you've seen the US as the problem, China as the problem, we also instinctively today think US is part of the answer. But then if you think the US is part of the answer, we need to have a better appreciation of what exactly is the US thinking on this, and whether we can actually rely on the US as a long-term partner in dealing with Chinese power. Because for India, irrespective of what the US does, what Russia does, we have a China problem that we have to deal with. But today we see working with the US gives us a better chance of producing productive outcomes. So therefore, we need to understand the US and its role for the future. So let me now turn to Bridge. Bridge, I think, let me begin by asking you, what changed in the US during 2017-18? You were in the government, you produced that report, National Defense Strategy. You were also involved with the National Security Strategy of 2017, which actually broke from the 3 decades of the post-Cold War thinking to frame a problem from China and Russia. How did that happen, and why did that happen?
Well, first off, thank you to you, Raja, for you're chairing this session, and thank you to the Anna Center for hosting it. I'm delighted. Actually, everything you said you could just reverse the United States and India, and it would actually hold pretty true. So, part of what I'm doing, this is related to my book, but my hope with the book is to stimulate and encourage engagement and hopefully productive kind of policy and intellectual and strategic engagement with our closest allies and partners. And none is more important over the long term than India. And I don't say that in a kind of romantic way. It's just the facts of the matter. India and Japan, I think, are the 2 most significant states in the international system relevant to this problem. I'm happy to go into that. But so it's really a pleasure to be able to talk to you and this audience that's a very sophisticated one. To your question about the nature of the change in 2017, 2018, some of it was, I would say, contingent sort of factors relating to the Trump administration and the exclusion, frankly, of the sort of many of the kind of Mandarinate class, I think of, that, basically people very invested, or invested is a little damning, but sort of oriented towards the status quo and incremental change. And President Trump, whatever his virtues and demerits, was definitely somebody who opened up the possibility for change, kind of broke the China, so to speak, or broke the mold. And that enabled significant shifts. And I think an orientation that was more focused on if not the scholarly vision of realism, at least an idea that American foreign policy needed to be more correct, more directly linked to the interests of the American people, which I think is absolutely correct. Although, optimally done so in an enlightened way, which is certainly the approach I take in my book. But I think that was the reason. But I'd also say, Henry Kissinger puts at one point that strategic shifts cannot be the products of virtuoso performances; they have to reflect underlying realities. And I'm certainly of the same view. I mean, in the sense, there were a greater number of, if you use the Thomas Kuhn paradigm of science, there were more and more errors in the Newtonian physics that was of the foreign policy attitude, and that a new paradigm was needed, and that's what we were trying to develop, and I'm trying to develop in my book. Unfortunately, there's still a lot of Newtonians in the American system, and we're only getting more and more. We're only getting more and more errors, in a sense, and sort of fundamental structural tensions in the model. But that's where we are now.
In fact, that was my next question, actually, whether the current change of confronting Chinese power in Asia, the Indo-Pacific, will it sustain? Here, it's quite fascinating that just as US policy changed in 2017, now in 18, India's own policy actually changed in 2017 after the Doklam crisis. Till then, we had two other crises in 2014 on our northern borders, in 2013. But yet the hesitancy to ask basic questions about China and its role, it's really after 2017, India, begins to think of, the problems with China and the importance of working with the US, and which is what happened in the US as well. The return of the Quad, the framing of the Quad, the Indo-Pacific. But it's interesting that both Delhi and Washington profoundly misread the implications of China's rise. India had a territorial dispute with China, but yet we thought we could work with China. The US had a huge economic engagement with China. It was one of the biggest trade relationships the world has ever seen. And in the US, large sections of the US elite were in love or still in love with China. Wall Street, the Silicon Valley, and there is speculation that they might still be putting pressure on the Biden administration to reverse course. So is the current policy that it was surprising that Biden has persisted with the Trump policies on China? Do you think this will sustain, or the pressure to change course in the days ahead?
So I think it has to sustain. I think you're absolutely right that there is, the story of the China trade kind of approach and overall policy that you mentioned is partly a story of elite interest and particular interests within American society. That's sort of, I don't say that in a conspiratorial way, but just a natural situation. I will say that I think over the long term, our policy towards China, along with our policy in the Middle East, and our policy probably towards financial liberalization in the 2000s, will be some of the great failures seen. I think that just manifestly, U.S. policy, particularly in the 2000s and maybe the late 1990s, was catastrophic failure. We brought China into the WTO without holding them to account, ostensibly under the idea that they would liberalize, although many people profited from it. We embarked on attempts to transform the Middle East, total failures that probably made the situation worse. And as a friend of mine puts it, under the Bush administration, at least, apparently President Bush's attitude was, I don't want to hear about China, which, if you're a rising great power, that's literally the best possible situation you can have. It's sort of benign neglect, because our companies were pouring money and intellectual property and sort of into China. And so John Mearsheimer has written a very good article about this in Foreign Affairs a couple of months ago. But we are where we are. I think that, again, structure is going to be determinative. China is such an obvious and manifest overwhelming threat now. It's so powerful, it can't hide behind, being a small China, just another developing nation kind of thing. And that's obvious to, I think, people, including in the United States. And China's behavior, you can't go back to hide and bide once you've done Doklam and you've done the South China Sea and you've done Taiwan and you've talked about blood and bones and stuff in a great wall of human flesh or whatever Xi Jinping recently said. It's not credible. And I think politically, you see that in the United States. I was at the biggest defense conference in the US is out in California. It's called the Reagan National Defense Conference. And there was a big, statistic that Reagan had done a polling, and China is identified as the priority threat by the majority of the American people, and including Republicans and Democrats. And in fact, in some ways, I actually think that, people outside of the elite kind of circles or areas are more worried about China because they felt the deindustrialization aspects or fentanyl and stuff like that. So there are elements like in Wall Street that are clearly trying to push a softer line. But I mean, I don't think President Biden did a shift on China because of, he read, some think tank study. I think he identified the political reality and also the geopolitical reality was so manifest it can't possibly be shifted. So I don't see a significant pushback. What I do see, Raja, if I could expand on your question just a little bit, I think the real debate now is what is the nature of the China threat and what do we have to do about it? So, if you, I think if I can simplify, my approach is, or my view is that it's regional. The decision is primarily going to be in the area of hard military and economic power, and it has a very, very significant military component focused on Asia. And the implications of that are a much more laser-like focus as needed by the United States on Asia, to the exclusion of other theaters and interest if necessary. The conventional wisdom, and I think the view in the Biden administration, and Jake Sullivan, the National Security Advisor, wrote a piece along these lines, actually kind of responding to an earlier piece of mine in foreign policy a couple of years ago, is that it's more of a global competition. It's economic, technological, informational, ideological, and a little bit military. And that it's not going to work. It's going to require working with the Europeans just as much, if not more, than India, or let alone Vietnam or Thailand or something. And I think that's what the Biden administration is doing. That's their theory of the case. I mean, I think that's why they've spent so much time, getting the EU and the G7 and so forth to make statements about, say, Taiwan, which I'm not against that. I don't think that's going to make a fundamental difference. And I think, just to be brief, I think what we're going to need is what I think of as an anti-hegemonic coalition, which is basically a balancing coalition, not a containment, a balancing coalition oriented on a negative goal, which will encourage an ecumenism among its members. We're a democracy of a particular kind, but if Vietnam has a shared goal, we should work with Vietnam and strengthen them. And I don't like communism. It's not about that. It's about the shared negative goal. That's the key. Unfortunately, China has both an ability and interest in trying to bring that coalition down without precipitating a total war through what I think of as a focused and sequential strategy. Basically, the selective and careful employment of coercive force to try to cause a run on the bank, if you will, of this coalition. And I think at the end of the day, if China wants to pursue that, it will need to resort to military force. So we need a military capability to deny China that ability. If we can do that, though, I think we'll be able to stand up together. We can create a geoeconomic area with sufficient scale to balance China. But right now, we're not in a good place, especially vis-a-vis Taiwan.
Before we get to the counter-hegemonic coalition and the problems with it, I just want to ask three general problems with the strategy that we hear. One is Europe versus Asia, or you can even make it Russia versus China. That the American, how an administration that started out with the Indo-Pacific and the Quad is today forced to deal with the Russian question in Central Europe. That is one part. And the second is the Middle East versus Far East, if you will. The pull of the Middle East, which has taken US energies in the last 3 decades. Is it really easy for the US to shake off the Middle Eastern commitments and to really devote exclusively to the Far East? And finally, the third aspect is there is a tyranny of geography in Asia that our Chinese friends say, look, Uncle Sam is far away, so he can't really save you. I mean, so I'm here next door to you. You might as well be nice to me and deal with me rather than relying on a distant power while I'm here in the heart of Asia. And China also tells Americans that, look, forget the small guys, let's do a deal. We can work it out. We don't need to depend on the small guys. So these three sets of issues, Europe versus Asia, Middle East versus Far East, and the tyranny of geography, how does your strategy deal with these three issues?
Well, directly, actually. And I think you're right. I mean, I think what we're seeing is the lack of sufficient conviction or understanding of the fundamentals of geopolitics. I mean, and what I would say the policy logic of my book, if I could be so immodest, is to drive in very clear terms to the American people and their leaders how exactly we need to think about prioritization and why. And what we're seeing right now is that a lot of this pivot to Asia stuff is very fuzzy. You know, it's very fuzzy. People say things like China's important, but Europe is also important, but we can't ignore the Middle East. And in effect, that results in stasis. And we cannot afford stasis because China is so powerful. And so what I'm trying to say is, look, geopolitics is not foreign to a republic like ours. In fact, I think geopolitics is the obligation of our government because geopolitics is the political reality in which we live. And if we're going to serve the citizenry, we need to take account of geopolitics. That's not, you know, and I think in India, that seems to be a less fraught issue. But in the United States, there's this overhang of the kind of liberal internationalism that's been so dominant over the last generation, much to our detriment, frankly. But I think the reality is very straightforward. And this is a point, Raja, that I find it's frustrating because I don't get direct contravention of my argument. Rather, I get discomfort and sort of bridges too much into prioritization. But you know, to me, what we really care about is the dominance of a very large market area by a potentially hostile power. And by the only scenario that really need concern us, and it's very concerning, is that China could dominate Asia, and Asia will be upwards of 50% of global GDP. So in some sense, everybody in Asia and beyond will be working for the Asian market. You know, I mean, that's the reality of future geoeconomics. And China, as you say about the tyranny of distance, it's also 20 to 25% of global GDP. So it has a very realistic possibility of attaining a regionally hegemonic position. And what exactly that would look like, I don't pretend to know. I don't think it would be direct, imperial control, because that's inefficient and causes more problems than it's worth. But what it would be is a kind of a hegemonic situation in which everybody's economy is oriented around China's. Its military has to, kowtow and all that, and its political and security relationships are, everything is by your leave in Beijing. So that's what it wants. If that's true, then Europe is not that important, and Europe really isn't that important relative. It is important interest, but even Joseph Borrell, the EU foreign policy leader, pointed out in a recent article that Europe will be about 10% of global GDP within 20 years. So there's this emotional and kind of sentimental attachment to Europe, primarily on the democratic side, which is kind of an interesting thing, but we can leave that aside for now. And the Middle East is even less important. I mean, the Middle East is just not that important, frankly. I mean, there's the Gulf resources, but the only powers that could plausibly really, I mean, Russia can't project power that far. Iran is a relatively limited threat and can be balanced by the Abrahamic coalition partners, which we should support. So the only power that could dominate the Middle East would be China. But if India and the United States stand between China and the Middle East, it won't be able to do that by definition, in a sense. And this again relates to the hard power, soft power divide, because people say, well, they'll create enough influence, and that's where that hard power, soft power thing comes in, because I don't think that theory works, and I'm happy to go into that. But I think this is why it's so dangerous, and I've been very publicly arguing we should not be putting more troops into Europe. And the last thing we want to be doing right now is reassuring our NATO allies. We want them to internalize the cost and risk of their continued laggard behavior, particularly the Germans. I mean, the president yesterday was literally covering them with garlands and flowers, which is literally the opposite of what we should be doing. The ones we should be applauding are the ones who are lacerating the Poles, who actually do have a serious military that would cause the Russians problems. So, and at the end of the day, and I don't want this to happen, but at the end of the day, a Russian invasion into Europe would culminate somewhere in Eastern Europe and would be a manageable situation for us. But if we lose over Taiwan, the Chinese are not going to stop at Taiwan. They have a military to project power against the Philippines, which I think would be next, or maybe Vietnam, and ultimately slice this anti-hegemonic coalition into its parts and then cause it to collapse. To your point about the tyranny of geography, I think this is a point that I talk about at some length in the book. This is Edward Luttwak is fond of the points of paradox of strategy. Well, proximity is both an advantage and a disadvantage. It's an advantage in that, of course, you can deploy military power directly, interior lines. The disadvantage is everybody is scared of you. Being far, we have a military problem, but nobody's that scared of us, and not because we're particularly nice. You know, the line about Mexico is that it's too close to the United States, too far from God. So if you ask the Mexicans, they don't have such a. But in Asia, we're very far away. So, you know, power and influence attenuate over distance. So that gives us a good balancing, the classic sort of balancing advantage. And what I would just say is, and of course, the strategic choice and prioritization is possible. There's this sort of faux, worldly kind of conceit that strategic prioritization is not possible. But, my good friend and comrade Wes Mitchell, partner in the Marathon Initiative, he points to the example of the British before the First World War, where they settled very long-standing disputes with France, of course, 1,000 years, Russia in South Asia, Japan in the Far East, and with us for 100 years. And they settled them all and oriented on Germany. So, these things are, I mean, we focused after the defeat in Vietnam, we refocused back on the Central Theater in Europe. It is possible, but for a variety of reasons, we're not doing it. But we can.
Yeah.
Victory is possible. Not victory, but tolerable political success is possible.
So I think that brings me to your core conception of the counter-hegemonic coalition that you talk about, the need to construct one in Asia. Now, you use the word coalition and not alliance. I mean, there's always, in India, of course, Indians are allergic to alliances, though we've had, deep partnerships when India was in the middle of a crisis. So when you talk about coalition, are you meaning alliances, or are you looking at more looser forms of collaboration, flexible, overlapping coalitions in the region?
Well, very advisedly, and thinking very much of India, the latter. I very self-consciously and intentionally use the term coalition, not alliance. In fact, India, to me, is a model of what we want, which is that India is a country that wants and has the national pride and ability to basically shoulder its own security issues, and we should help India be the best at that it can be. But I mean, to be frank, actually, I don't, even if we could create an Asian NATO, which I don't think is plausible for the reasons you suggest, geography, but I actually don't think it's worth it. I mean, in Asian NATO, you get a lot of, it's a little bit of the issue with the Quad. You get a lot of effort put into sort of symbols and flags on tables and so forth. But at the end of the day, when you talk about military capability that's arrayed along the critical lines of defense, it's not that great. I mean, people talk about how great NATO is, but actually, I think if you were creating an alliance again now to deal with Russia, you wouldn't create NATO. You wouldn't have Portugal and Spain in it with veto power. I mean, that's so actually what we want is probably a mix. And you said that we're going to create an anti-hegemonic coalition. I don't think we're going to create it. The Chinese are creating the anti-hegemonic coalition by their behavior. What we are doing is we are working with and again, this is so elemental to my approach. We are working with the grain of geopolitics and states' interests and making the best out of that. We're not going to convince China, or we're not going to convince India that it has a China problem. India knows it has a China problem, and that China problem is not going to go away. We're going to work with India and kind of leverage that. I think alliances will play a critical role. Of course, we're, where we are with Japan and Australia and so forth, and Taiwan, South Korea, Philippines. And those probably make sense because, I think alliances should be husbanded in our case for those countries that are really on the borderline between standing strong against China and then bandwagoning. Where they're nervous and they need a security commitment. I mean, in the last generation, we've been sort of willy-nilly handing out security commitments like it's a lollipop or something. We need to be very judicious. And so I think along the first island chain, we need to hold the line because that's the maritime theater is our advantage. Aerospace and maritime is where we're strongest. We're established there already. There's a lot of wealth there. The question to me will be, and then I think with India, we'll likely have an ally in the pre-1914 sense, which is very real and aligned and working together, but not highly structured, formalized, or integrated. In fact, I don't think we want an integrated relationship. I think we want a relationship in which we empower India to take a leading role in South Asia, and we take a backseat. That's what it seems more of a division of labor. Where we will have that question is, I think, in Southeast Asia, which to me will probably become, and you've spent a lot of time there. I was born in Singapore, but we will have some. That will be where the competition, the arena will go, and we'll have to see what that happens. But ideally, to me, we would not make any more alliance commitments, because that puts our what I think of as our differentiated credibility on the line. Our interest is in husbanding that, but we will have to see as things progress and how China behaves.
No, I think this resonates very well with the Indians, that this is not about the US coming and telling us what to do, but India has a problem, and that the US will help or empower India to deal with its problem. So this is not a US, the control freak, trying to design a new architecture. But as you said, it's really working with those in the region who have a problem with China and are willing to face up to the challenge. So I think this is very reassuring for many in India, and that we're not being dragged into some kind of a US-led kind of coalition. So this makes it, but I think this is not, we don't hear this often. So I think the way you put it makes it far more attractive for India. The second is the paradox, I mean, that we're beginning to see. When I recently came out of Southeast Asia, where there was a time when India used to talk about non-alignment, and it is the Southeast Asians who are closer to the US. So they would tell us, look, you're crazy, you're non-aligned. But today, Thailand is supposed to be one of the oldest allies of the United States. I don't know what to think of that, whether they're really much closer to China today. Philippines, which has a direct problem from the US, from China, but the president was trying to, find ways to, hoping that the Chinese will somehow give him a better deal. South Korea, which is a treaty ally, which is really so much closer to China today. So while you had the traditional allies seem shaky, India, which has stepping out on its own and is willing to work with the US in a manner that it was not there before. So how do you reflect on this paradox?
Well, I think well, first of all, it's great to hear what you said about Indian reaction, and that's my hope. And I hope that my approach becomes the ascendant one. I think it has the force of logic and reality behind it. But I agree, we do have this, what's the frame you use, the bossy or kind of know-it-all or intrusive habit, especially in the strategic culture of our government. And people are used to being more like proconsuls or wannabe proconsuls or something like that, rather than really, diplomats and kind of allies. And we need to create that new strategic culture in the United States. That's part of the task for us, is not that we're going around and converting the heathen, but rather that we're working in a geopolitical alignment and working with other countries in the way that's most effective for us, but also realistic. So that's great to hear. I would say, look, I think that's a lot of the drama, if you will, of the geopolitical situation is exactly what you're talking about. So, I mean, in a sense, we have to be, and again, this is also a shift for the mindset of our strategic elite, is not everything is fixed in stone. I mean, we may have to move, we are already moving lines. Now there's an advantage to a conservatism when you make dramatic shifts, because it can reverberate and you can cause, run on the currency, if you will, if you go too far. But we have to adapt. The whole point of our alliance network for us is to benefit our interests, to make geopolitical sense. And of course, it's aligned with your interests. I don't say that in a zero-sum way. It's aligned, I think, but that we have to align it. And if things don't make sense, then, as I think Salisbury said, nothing worse than the dead carcass of old policies or something like that. And so we need to adapt. And I think, I think there's a mixture. I mean, basically, if you look at it structurally, my sense almost, Raja, and I'd be curious what you think of this, is that actually Asia, there will almost be like a geometric, almost like a gravitational quality to geopolitics in Asia. In a way, Asia is going to be more straightforward because of the distance issue you mentioned. That if the United States is Jupiter, and in the solar system there's another Jupiter, and I'd ask you what India would be, but work with me with the Jupiter example for a second, which is the countries near to that other Jupiter, China, they're gonna have a necessary reaction to it, because that's where the aggressiveness and the power will be most manifest. And so, unsurprisingly, the second level states in Asia, India and Japan, are moving much closer to us. Japan is an established ally. India is a different relationship during the Cold War, but it's a similar model. Australia we could go into for a variety of reasons. Then there are the sort of, I think the countries along, in our group that are, finding their way. I mean, obviously Taiwan is moving in our direction. I think South Korea, at the end of the day, I'm optimistic, because I think and I've said this to them directly, I think it's a bad idea for a country on the battle line, essentially, that first island chain, to be neutral, because that turns you into a battleground. Whereas if you are aligned with one side or the other, you will have a forward defense. So I think probably with the change of administration in South Korea, we're likely to see an improvement, but especially over time, because I think it will become too dangerous if it's misaligned. The Philippines, I think, really the geography is so critical for us. We have to work with them. Again, that's an area where we have to, put a sock, if you will, in our moralism, in a sense, and work with the reality. But it's a critical piece of the puzzle. I think in Southeast Asia, and I think my approach, I really take very seriously the we don't want to choose element. So in a sense, a lot of what my strategy is designed to do is to assemble an anti-hegemonic coalition that doesn't rely too much on, say, Indonesia or Malaysia, which are going to free ride as long as they possibly can, right? They're behind the line. They have great trading relations with China. Even Singapore, it looks, like it's trying to play that a lot. Contrarily, I think Vietnam is probably, we have a sunny future together. I mean, we have to work with the fact that, it's directly neighbors China, so it's more intimidated, and it has the communist element in it as well. But I think over time, so I think that's going to be, I think we can see the outlines of what's going to happen. And in a way, it's kind of interesting because it's a reverse of our orientation or alignment during the Cold War, when the Soviet Union was our big problem, China was our partner, Vietnam was an enemy, Cambodia was our partner to some extent, even in the 70s, India was a problem, and Pakistan was our partner. Now we're flipped. And the one outstanding one is Russia, which is a huge problem in our geopolitics, that we have such an adversarial relationship with Russia, and we need to move in a different direction. But the question is how to get from here to there, and how to avoid disaster in Europe. I mean, while Europe is less important, we don't want to lose the farm there. And unfortunately, our policy has not been oriented this way, but this is what we should be doing.
Before we, turn to the audience questions, one of the things you said in your Hindustan Times article the other day was about burden sharing. That unlike in Europe, where they don't want to spend too much on defense, they just want the US to do more and complain when the US does more. Here, Japan, India, and Australia, they're ready to spend more. They're willing to take more responsibility. So, when you talk about burden sharing, that look, these are not countries that are trying to free ride on the US, but are willing to do more in their own regions. But can you sell this idea in Washington that look, either Americans, either my way or highway, either I do it all myself or I don't? So how much of a traction is there for the notion of burden sharing that help local regions to fight for themselves rather than?
So I think you're exactly right. I mean, with some of our allies, who needs is the expression with friends like these, who needs enemies? With allies like these, who needs partners are so much better, right? I mean, we don't. India is the model. Vietnam is a model. Vietnam doesn't want a security commitment. Great. I don't want a land war in Asia. I want to help them. I mean, we were on the wrong end of that situation for a while, so that's great. I mean, that's not to pour. I mean, the South Koreans do a great job. They spend a lot on defense. Japanese are working, but they need improvement and pressure. Australia is great, but yeah, the Europeans are. I mean, it's embarrassing in a lot of cases, particularly the Germans. It's really scandalous, actually, frankly. But yeah, I think that's right. Can I sell it? I'm trying hard. As somebody put, I'm a man on a mission. Here's what I'll say. I think the structure, and I actually think the political tea leaves, if you will, are with me. Americans, I was talking actually to a German reporter, this guy from the Süddeutsche Zeitung, which is the one of the kind of, I think it's slightly left-leaning, national papers in Germany. And I was talking to him the other day, and I was really giving it to him on the Germans. And he'd been out in Ohio, and he's like, nobody's interested in NATO out there. Nobody. So I mean, I think the problem is the elite, especially the blob, which is a real thing, and that gets into. I mean, the reality in the American system is the Constitution was structured to make foreign policy very much an elite exercise. The only elected politician in the foreign policy structure, in a sense, is the president. Simplifying a little bit, but that's unlike a lot of our domestic policy. But I think politically, the interests of the American people are not in continuing to enable European free riding, and we can't afford it manifestly. And so there's also a generational issue where a lot of the leading voices on these issues are, they came of age in a different era, and it's very hard at a certain point for some people to adapt. But younger people, I mean, under the age of say 60 or 55 or what have you, on both the Republican and the Democratic side have a different view, I would say, most of them. And so as that class or cadre gets into influence, I think you're likely to see more change.
Bridge, I want to ask you, before we go to the questions, I mean, you spend a lot of time on Taiwan, on the importance of defending Taiwan, not just because there is a Ukraine crisis today, but the centrality of Taiwan to sustain this anti-hegemonic coalition, because if the US can't defend Taiwan, then everything else simply collapses. And I think in India, at least, we still don't have enough appreciation of the geopolitical centrality of Taiwan, not just as one China, two Chinas, but its geographic location. So maybe you could tell us briefly why Taiwan is important, why the defense of Taiwan is so critical in your strategy, and then I'll move to the questions from the audience.
Sure, and I'll say it's a geopolitical analysis and a deductive analysis. And what I would say is it won't mean the collapse of the anti-hegemonic coalition, but will be a major, major blow. We will be much weaker. And actually, paradoxically, I think we will have to do more extreme and ill-advised things if we fail to defend Taiwan. And so, Taiwan it's not the center. In fact, it's actually kind of the reverse. It's the vulnerable edge of our alliance commitment. Now, I would say that the three reasons why Taiwan is so important are: one, it's critical to America's differentiated credibility. I mean, I tend to think a lot of analyses of credibility are exaggerated, but what is clear is if you're in Manila or Seoul, let alone Hanoi, and you see the United States fail to defend or fail to effectively defend Taiwan, you cannot but make deductions about what that means for you, and rationally so. Because the United States is, whether we like it or not, basically committed to Taiwan's defense. We don't recognize Taiwan as an independent state, but we have made it clear over the years that we oppose Taiwan's subjugation by force. And so, we already hear that from Duterte. He's more impolitic, but everybody's thinking that. And the Japanese have become increasingly clear about what that means. So there's the credibility issue. There's the military significance issue, which is that Taiwan is in the middle of the first island chain. It's essentially a kind of a cork. It's not totally hermetically sealed cork, but it is a cork that inhibits Chinese power projection. So that China would, if it seized Taiwan, would of course have the resources of Taiwan, but would be able to project power from Taiwan. And the third point why I think it's important is if, let's say, we fail to defend Taiwan and those credibility issues happen, people would really doubt American resolve to stand up to China. I think we would have to do things that were, in a sense, more provocative and more dangerous to compensate. Would we have to, say, try to make Vietnam an ally or Thailand a real ally as opposed to something fuzzy like it is? Those are not good ideas, and that would be on the Asian mainland, which is not where we want to be. We don't want to be in a land war. Despite a lot of patting our backs, America tends to be best not at beating Nazi Germany or something like that on land, but at naval and aerospace warfare, highly capital intensive, value added kind of military operations rather than, we fought the Chinese when they were a primitive military, they were far behind us technologically in the 50s, and they fought us to a standstill. Yeah. And so, and they're much better off now. So, at least in capacity. So Taiwan to me I actually say, and I say this to them, it's like a 70-30 interest. But, the key then is to be able to have a military strategy that allows us to defend Taiwan in a way that's sane, that doesn't blow up our economy or automatically lead to large-scale nuclear war or something like that. And that's more demanding. And that's one of the reasons why it creates more of a demand from other theaters and thus substantiates a more division of labor model, because we need the laser focus. And the other thing is, if we can defend Taiwan, we can defend Japan, we can defend Philippines, we can defend Australia, we can defend the Central Pacific. So as you've heard, I haven't said anything about the fact that Taiwan is a democracy, which I admire and which will make Taiwan more sympathetic to Americans. That's all great, but it's not really the reason we're doing it. But I think it's definitely worth doing, but it's critical to make it worth doing by having a military strategy that's rational to implement.
No, there is a question. The first question was on actually Taiwan and the link between what's happening in Ukraine. Does it embolden China to do a military operation on Taiwan, or that the risks are too high and the US can ignore Ukraine at the end of it, but can it really ignore Taiwan? So in a sense, the stakes in Taiwan are much higher. Would that be right to say that?
Yeah, the stakes in Taiwan are much higher, despite the rhetoric in Washington today. I mean, Taiwan is about the anti-hegemonic coalition, right? The example I like to use is, in a sense, what we fear, and what I think India should fear also, is relatively small, limited, small in the grand sense, especially differentiated from a total war, small wars that can have systemic effects. So the example I like to point to, and I'm sure they're good ones from Indian history as well, but is the example of the wars of German unification, where it had been a truism of the balance of power politics in Europe for centuries that Germany could not be unified, right? It had been a central goal of going back to Richelieu, not to allow Germany to be unified under any state. In the matter of 7 years between 1864 and 1871, Prussia was able to unify without a total war, with a war that by the standards of European history in the 20th and preceding centuries were quite small, but were immensely decisive. And essentially led to the First and Second World Wars. That is what we need to worry about. And that is where Taiwan is relevant. Taiwan is not necessarily everything falls apart, but we are in a really bad way, and it's certainly going to be costlier. And that's the sense in which I think that we should not be sending anything to Europe. We should be withdrawing troops from Europe. Now, sure, could we put some, candidly, if I were deciding, could I put like a couple of forces here or there? Whatever, okay, fine. But the message, and it should be very clear, and the logic should be very clear. If I were in the White House, I would say every day I want a news report on how we're improving our ability to defend Taiwan. I want an update, and I'm going to fire anybody who's not moving fast enough. And I don't see that. I don't see that happening. And I think just to answer the question directly, I do think that Russian action in Ukraine and Europe will make a Taiwan conflagration more likely. Now, will it mean a Taiwan invasion? I don't know, and I don't think that's clear, because the biggest issue for China has got to be whether they can pull it off. And I don't know if they're there yet. And that's, of course, a dynamic assessment, and we don't really know. But certainly, the problem of a simultaneous conflict is very real. If we're getting distracted in Europe and we're literally using forces that are needed for a Taiwan scenario, that increases the attractiveness to China's action. And I don't know what Xi and Putin have been talking about, obviously, but I would imagine this kind of thinking has come up in their conversations. It's probably not an accident, as the Marxists used to say, and at least one of them is still a Marxist, and the other was a Marxist. So, they probably were thinking along these lines.
I thought we called them red capitalists, but that's a different story. But two questions on economics. I think one, drawing attention to there was a time when industrial policy was a bad word in the United States, but today, the House has just passed a new bill, the need to strengthen U.S. domestic capabilities to deal with Chinese competition. The other aspect is the trade aspect on the regional comprehensive economic partnership, that the U.S. withdraw, from, TPP. It's turned towards industrial policy, and the whole range of policies that we've seen started in Trump, but being persistent under Biden. These are big changes, right? Is there a battle on this issue, or see from the political side we see there's a convergence, but on trade side there's still a lot of pressure on the system to compromise with China. So where do you see this going?
Well, structurally, I think it's clear that we need to be able to generate a geoeconomic zone that's large enough to match the scale and sophistication of the Chinese economy. So we will have to have some kind of larger trading area. That just seems to be inevitable to me. But unfortunately, the political will does not exist. And I don't really blame the American people. The people who are responsible for this are the free trade zealots and the financial liberalization zealots who pursued a policy over the last particularly in the 1990s, 2000s, that led to the financial markets collapse, the largest, economic downturn since the Depression, and widespread deindustrialization in the United States. And people say, well, okay, that's not the fault of the trade agreement. Well, I'm not an economist, but people basically think that, and on both sides they do, and there's obviously something to it. So I think, what I think about free trade is, to me, is like not worth anybody's time, because I'm a foreign policy guy. I live in the Beltway. What is going to be needed is somebody or people who leadership, and this is kind of a cheap comment, but I think this is real, who understand the depth of the skepticism about the old style Bob Zoellick free trade style, can deliver the political credibility on that trade agreements are in Americans' interests, working Americans' interests, but also understands the strategic logic. And I mean, I think, somebody like what Lighthizer was talking, Bob Lighthizer was talking, he's a much more of a skeptic, but I think it's more of a geoeconomic point of view as we go to that. It's going to be much more important. And I think some of the, it's worth, Hillary Clinton said she was not going to go through with TPP. Who knows what she really would have done. But clearly that was the mood in the country. So, but, as you indicate, it's obviously essential that there be a geoeconomic strategy. So I think what Japan is doing right now to try to kind of keep the chair open for the United States is important. But I don't have this is kind of where my mind's going next, is thinking about this. But I think we're going to have to go through the politics, which are very real and genuine and justified in a lot of ways, before we can get to a good solution. The problem is, of course, China is moving while we're doing that.
There's a specific question on RCEP, that the fact that Japan and Australia, two leading members of Quad, their treaty allies of the United States, they continue to participate in RCEP. While India said, look, RCEP is Chinese dominated, therefore we don't want Chinese economic hegemony, and walked out. So how do you explain Japan and Australia's economic policies, that they're willing to continue to be in the Chinese economic sphere while taking deep strategic political positions against Beijing today?
Well, I actually have what might be a little bit of a surprising view. I tend to be more sanguine on economic engagement with China in a lot of respects, because if we go back again to this, I think this root sort of intellectual assessment, I'm very concerned about hard power and military power. And that's not because I like to shoot guns in my spare time. It's because, and I go into this in the book a lot, I think it's very difficult to turn soft power leverage and even economic leverage into political outcomes, especially political outcomes that the targeted country really does not want to give up. And I think Australia is actually a good example, which is very dependent on exports to China. The Chinese are obviously trying to get them to do things they don't want right now, and the reverse is happening, right? And I think our record with sanctions, look, we've had an embargo on Cuba with little to show for it for over 60 years. Same with Iraq and in North Korea, et cetera. And I think that China's finding this right now, and I think it's likely to continue finding this. And this, to me, the good news is that countries will be able to stand up and still have a significant economic relationship with China. Not what you'll have to reduce is the exposure to things they could squeeze, and you would have to go to your knees. Whatever that thing is, I don't know what semiconductors, or it could be something as simple and as pineapples on Taiwan. You may not want your to be so vulnerable on the pineapple issue that you can't do anything about it. But that's going to be important. But the bad news is that it's going to increase the attractiveness of the military instrument to China, because I don't think they're going to find the economic, all the BRI stuff. It's going to help them in a lot of ways, but I think it's going to be hard to turn that into concrete, lasting political outcomes for a variety of reasons. Where I think that, and again, this is kind of where my thinking is moving, is what does that mean for decoupling? To me, the decoupling is going to be selective. There is going to continue to be a significant engagement economically with China on our part, and that's okay, as long as it's not such that it would essentially affect our core decision making on strategic issues. And what exactly that means, I don't know, but that's my view.
Two questions on military. One, can the Quad be moved up to be a serious military partnership to cope with China's hegemonic posture in South China Sea and to counter PLA's forays into the Indian Ocean? The other is China's string of pearls, the creation of their bases. They have the first base is in Djibouti in Indian Ocean. probably there'll be more. So when the US focuses on the Indo-Pacific, is it really about the Pacific for all practical purposes? And the Indian Ocean does not really figure much in that strategy.
Sure. The Quad, I don't know. I'm all for the Quad. I think it's great. I don't think we should spend a lot of time and effort trying to turn the Quad into a formal military relationship for the reasons I suggested earlier, that I think it's going to be tricky, controversial, and the net result will be a lot less than the effort is worth. Whereas if we can work under the aegis of Quad or whatever, say bilaterally, to strengthen India's military capacity and intelligence capacity, whatever it might be, that would be much better. So I don't, if the Quad meets once a year or whatever and says nice things, but doesn't say certain things, like, I don't, if India never says anything about Taiwan, okay, like, that's not the biggest issue. The biggest issue is India's ability, again, in South Asia, and that relates to the second one. You're right. I am not a huge fan of the Indo-Pacific. When I was in the government, I kind of pushed back on the Indo-Pacific moniker, not because it isn't true in the broad sense, but from our point of view, and I think actually from India's point of view, ultimately, the Pacific, and particularly the Western Pacific, is the critical military theater, because in order for China to project power, it's got to get out from the maritime perspective, right? And if we can keep them in the first island chain, though, they're going to be limited, right? They can't project military power into the Indian Ocean unless they go out the maritime route. Now, maybe they could create naval bases and air bases in Myanmar and Pakistan. That's possible, but then that would be a separate problem. But also, there's a long logistical line, as we learned in the Second World War, the Burma hump and all that, the hump and so forth. That would be a difficult problem for them. So to me, I would actually like close up Fifth Fleet. I would kind of close up CENTCOM as an operating area, and then in the Indian Ocean, I would basically be like, all right, India's in the lead. We're going to help, but it's based, and then maybe the British and the French, since they want to play. That would be a more natural area, because to get the British and the French to project all the way into the Western Pacific is going to be kind of hopeless. The Chinese military threat is going to be attenuated in the Indian Ocean. It's going to be significant, but it's going to be far most intense in the first island chain. So America really needs to focus there. And then I think the earlier point is exactly right, the scale of China's global ambitions is astounding. And I don't think it can really anymore be in doubt. I was just so flabbergasted by the Equatorial Guinea one. That's on the Atlantic coast. It's literally the other side of the world. It's in the Western, and I think it's in the Southern Hemisphere. That's flabbergasting. And the DoD military power report said they're looking in Mozambique, I think Tanzania, Tajikistan, Kenya. And that's what they said in public, right? So, you can infer reasonably, and not to say the American intelligence community is always right, but on that, usually you get the direction of travel right, basic direction of travel. So this is where it's going to go. But I think, to me, it's again this division of labor. America, Japan, and Australia really focused on the Western Pacific. India in the lead in South Asia. Europe taking care of its own situation. The Abraham Coalition in the Middle East. And then, if the Brits want to send the carrier to help the Indians out or in the Middle East, great. But that's sort of the basic model to me.
Yeah, I think we're coming to the witching hour. So one important question is a clear, specific question on Taiwan. How sure and confident are you about the possibility that the Japanese and the US armed forces can work together seamlessly to push back against China if and when PLA invaded Taiwan? So what kind of an assault, other than an outright military attack, would you say China should resort to attack Taiwan? So it's a specific question. You have anything to go into the details? We don't have too much time. But
yeah, I think I got it. I have no confidence that we would seamlessly integrate with the Japanese. In fact, to the contrary, what we should be doing is integrated, but actually US and Japanese forces are not integrated, unlike on the Korean Peninsula, where we have a combined forces command. That is actually what we should have with the Japanese. The Japanese are moving, a lot of it is still rhetorical, they need to move a lot faster. And they need to increase spending. I would say the Japanese should at minimum treble their defense spending. I don't know why they aren't. And if I were in Taiwan, I would want to spend 10% of defense spending, because the alternative is to live under the boot of Xi Jinping and maybe get sent to a re-education camp. And just specifically on the Taiwan scenario, I go into this a lot in the book because I think it's where the rubber meets the road. I do think they will have to invade at the end of the day if they really want to resolve the issue, because nobody on Taiwan wants to live under Chinese rule at this point. And nobody believes Beijing anymore because you've seen what's happened with one country, two systems and all this kind of thing. So, and you know, they've reelected Tsai Ing-wen, and probably even if the Kuomintang came back, it would probably be with a much different political complexion. So, you know, if you're in China, you have to reckon that you're going to have to use military force. And if you're going to use military force, you know, as Napoleon put it, if you're going to take Vienna, take Vienna. You could try a blockade or shutting down their phone lines or whatever, but that's probably just going to make them angry and the rest of the world sympathetic. And it's going to draw on the Americans anyway. And if you know that, then you just resolve it. And that's the thing to me that I also worry about is if all that's true, then if you're China, you want to give as little warning as possible, as little sense to give us time to mobilize. So something could, you know, again, I'm not saying it's going to, but if something were to happen, it would probably happen almost from one day to the next, because China has a real incentive to operational surprise.
Okay, Rich, I think we need to close this, and I'll close this by first thanking you and the Ananta Center for organizing this important talk. As I said in the beginning, that we need to pay more attention to the US debates and how the US is reflecting on the challenges that it faces in the Pacific in relation to China. Because for us, the US has become far more important for Indian security than it ever was. So that makes it, in fact, even more important for us to keep tracking, following, assessing how the US is dealing with these issues. So really been wonderful having you here, because someone like you who's been involved in these debates to present a particular viewpoint. I'll also say two other things as we close. One is the importance of Asian nationalism. Unlike Europe, where nationalism is a bad word, Asia is still very deeply nationalistic. I see the American friends keep talking about Chinese nationalism, 100 years of humiliation, as if they're the only ones who are humiliated in Asia, and as if the special Chinese, you know, sensitivity. Whole of Asia was colonized. Everyone had a century plus of humiliation. In fact, unlike China, the other countries were deeply colonized. So therefore, my belief is that for all the economic integration with China, most Asian nations are not simply going to cede and say, we've just gotten out of the American or the Western hegemony or the colonial rule just to go back into Chinese colonial rule. So I think you've got to have that faith in Asian nationalism, that it has reasons to stand up against any attempt at recolonizing them or subjecting them to a Tian Sha or a Chinese empire. So I think mobilizing that nationalism, and historically the West was not in tune with Asian nationalism. But today, by working with Asian nationalism, I think the chances of dealing with Chinese hegemony will get a lot better because it's much easier to work with those who have a stake in fighting. Even though elite capture, Chinese have done elite capture in many Asian countries through a whole smart power, if you will. But today, there will be opposition to that. And I think, therefore, working with Asian nationalism to cope with the Chinese hegemonic ambitions, I think must be a critical element. And it's not an American design that comes and sets it up here. So I think that's one thought I had. The second thought takes me back to K.M. Panikkar, who was a great strategist of this region, who wrote towards the end of the Second World War, his conception of what the post-war regional order would look like. It essentially be this we were talking about before partition, before the end of the war, before all kinds of things happened, that India, undivided India, would become the successor to the British Raj in ensuring peace and stability in the Indian Ocean, and that Britain and the West would support India to play that role. So that was the conception under which Panikkar thought an independent India, acting on its own, would be a security provider backed by the British Empire. And I think today we replace Britain with the United States. So that's where your ideas on division of labor, on burden sharing actually come together, that an India that is willing to stand up and provide support, ensure support for a rules-based order, can do it. And that India's aspiration to be that coincides with the US need to share burden. And I think building on this convergence of this synergy between the two of us is, I think, critical. And that's where your positions on division of labor come in so quickly. And I hope we can develop these ideas more deeply as we look ahead. So we've already passed the past time, and I'll stop here. Thank you once again, Rich,
Thank
for
you.
joining us this evening. And thank you for our colleagues from Ananta.
Thank you,
So,
Roger. Thank you, Ananda. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Rich, and good evening and good morning to our friends in the United States.
Good evening.